This is a counterattack. This is actually, in fact, defending ourselves. And that, at least to an extent, because the Americans are still moving step by step, it at least opened up, thanks to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, the authority to hit certain Russian positions close to the border. And Putin knows that now. And because Putin realizes that indeed the Kharkiv offensive may be in a bit of trouble, but beyond that, he may have opened up Russia to attacks in the longer run. Now he's got to scramble to try to deter the West in some other way with some other broad sweeping statement. So the latest $225 million dollars of U.S. aid is being drawn from this overall authorization, this breakthrough authorization we had of almost 61 billion in April. Now, there have been several packages since then. This one specifically has got components for HIMARS rocket systems, and I'll explain why those are important in just a second. It's got anti-tank missiles, it's got ammunition, it's got other equipment. It does not have, in this particular package, the long-range missiles, what are called the ATCMS missiles, which have been the focus of a lot of attention in terms of can they be used on strikes inside Russia. But the HIMARS rocket systems, which the U.S. has been providing to Ukraine probably since 2023, they have been used already since the U.S. relaxed its restrictions on strikes inside Russia. And of course, they have a more limited range, so they were used closer to the border. They were used on Russian missile batteries. So it has certainly a cumulative effect, this military aid which is going in terms of what's happening on the front line and beyond. But this also had a symbolic effect because, of course, this announcement was made when President Joe Biden was in Normandy, when, of course, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was also there, when Biden gave a couple of very high-profile speeches talking about how America will not leave Ukraine, will not let it down, where he apologized for that 6.5-month blockade by Trumpists and some Republicans on aid. You know, in other words, giving this whole idea of, yes, the U.S. is in it for the long run. And that was reinforced, again, as he announces this military package when he has this state visit in Paris, because, of course, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has also been ramping up both the French aid to Ukraine and also the statements about what might possibly be done in the forthcoming months. I think not just from Macron, but for a number of leaders in Europe. And I think you can count the Germans in the camp, who, of course, was Angela Merkel at one point, now it's Olaf Scholz, that they were looking to give Vladimir Putin an off-ramp, a diplomatic off-ramp, not to proceed with the invasion. And for those who can think back that far, you know, back closing in at the end of 2021, at the very start of 2022, when Macron did meet Putin in Moscow, the whole idea was, look, we will negotiate with the Russians in terms of guarantees for their security as well as security for Ukraine. And on February 24th, 2022, Putin scrapped all of that with a full military invasion. I think there was a few more weeks when Macron and European leaders thought maybe Putin would pull back, especially after the Russians were defeated in northern Ukraine and were forced to withdraw from there. But of course he didn't. And at some point, you know, you come to that realization that Putin does not want to negotiate, despite all the blah, blah, blah from the Kremlin, which says, oh, yes, you know, we'll talk peace. They don't. They want to conquer Ukraine. And Macron was converted by that, as indeed to an extent, not yet fully, but to an extent, the Germans were as well. So I think not just Macron, but other leaders, indeed a European consensus, except for an outlier like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is an ally of Putin. You know, that European consensus is, look, in terms of economic aid, financial aid, military aid, in terms of protecting ourselves, not only with military preparations, but with cybersecurity, information security, we've got to be prepared for a marathon rather than a sprint. Yeah, in other words, you have this linkage of the past and the present at a very, very poignant moment. And, you know, we're talking about the 80th anniversary. I think the oldest survivor from D-Day is 107. And of course, the youngest one would be in, you know, late 90s. You know, they will probably not be around for the 90th anniversary. And so for Joe Biden, for Emmanuel Macron, for Vladimir Zelensky, there was that, and because Ukraine, of course, was involved in World War II as well, there was that look back. but linking it to where we are now. And the speeches by Biden and Macron, and indeed by Zelensky, where they do talk about the world did unite against Adolf Hitler, did unite against Nazi Germany, and then saying, we have to decide whether we're going to unite against a threat which is in 2024, is very, very pointed. I'm not saying there will be World War III here, despite Vladimir Putin's chest thumping, nuclear weapons, I'll give weapons to other countries to attack, all of which he said in the past week. But I do think the fact that this isn't just a question of Ukraine, which is in the front line here. You're talking about European countries all along the East, from what from what Winston Churchill once said, from the Baltic to the Adriatic, from Stettin to Trieste. You have to expect that as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, we are in a state of what effectively is war, even if we are not directly involved in it with our own military forces being in Ukraine. First, I want to highlight the fact that this is another Vladimir Putin gamble, which could come up to bite him in the backside. Um, you know, it's always the case. You watch something like Doctor Who, and the bad guys, the villains, they just overreach just a bit, right? And then all of a sudden, there's a vulnerability that opens. Well, Vladimir Putin did that in February 2022 with the outset of this, thinking he could break Western support for Ukraine. And, because Ukraine resisted successfully, because it effectively defeated the Russians in the north by the spring of 2022, the West didn't back away. The West did, albeit belatedly at times, in a limited way at times, it did continue to support Ukraine to the point where, of course, beyond Ukraine, we're talking about the expansion of NATO, which is now stronger with Sweden and Finland in it. The possible expansion of the EU in years to come, with Ukraine and Moldova now entering accession talks in the near future. Well, in this immediate gamble, what did Putin do? Well, I'm going to send my forces into the Kharkiv region in northeast Ukraine, and I'm going to grab some territory, including some territory that Ukraine had regained uh, in the autumn of 2022. Now, because he did launch this as a cross-border attack, it was from Russia territory, because he's got aerial attacks from Russian bases, because the ground troops are coming across the border. He then presented uh, Zelensky with the argument to make to the US, to make to Britain, to make to France, which is, you've got to hit the Russian positions that are supporting this offensive. This is not innocent Russians that you're going to be hitting here. This is a counterattack. This is actually, in fact, defending ourselves. And that, at least to an extent, because the Americans are still moving step by step, it at least opened up, thanks to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, the authority to hit certain Russian positions close to the border. And Putin knows that now. And because Putin realizes that indeed the Kharkiv offensive may be in a bit of trouble, but beyond that, he may have opened up Russia to attacks in the longer run. Now he's got to scramble to try to deter the West in some other way with some other broad sweeping statement. It depends on, the persistence of the attacks. At one point earlier this year, 14% of Russian oil output was affected by this. And that's not insignificant, of course, given that Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers. Now, of course, the Russians have made repairs, but Ukraine has hit some oil installations since then. So at least it's been disruptive to the Russians. Now, I don't think it's going to break the Russian economy, especially because Russia's economy is on a wartime footing, but it does increase the cost to the Kremlin of maintaining that wartime economy. Not only do you have to keep devoting a lot of your resources to the military rather than to folks at home, you then actually have to expend some of your resource to make these repairs, to try to reconstruct. If the Americans relax the restriction on the use of the ATACMS missiles, which have a range of up to 300 kilometers, if if Britain and France release restrictions on the Storm Shadow and Scout missiles, and if Ukraine continues to be able to improve its drones, which have now struck up to 1,200 kilometers inside Russia, that poses, again, marathon, not a sprint, that poses a longer term problem for the Russians. Well, I suspect the Ukrainian delegation, like the rest of us, is trying to figure out who in the world advised Rishi Sunak to walk out of one of the last major D-Day ceremonies, with the survivors who are left, to come back to do an interview at that particular moment with a British television outlet in the election? Why couldn't why couldn't you waited 24 hours? And I'm not sure anyone has the answer to that question yet. And certainly Zelensky doesn't. But I think this is probably priced in. We never like to predict the outcome of elections, but I think you pretty much knew that Rishi Sunak was a prime minister on his way out. It's just going to happen on July the 4th now rather than in the autumn. And I think the importance for Ukraine is not to try to, think what are we going to do with Mr. Sunak. It's to think, all right, what are the links that we have with the British institutions? What are our links with the Ministry of Defense? What are our links with the Foreign Office here? What are our links with the Treasury? Let's maintain, the working relationship with those institutions, because of course the staff in those institutions do not change with an election. They are there, and you need that competence to continue. And I have to say that the one thing beyond what has been a horrible, horrible, at least 8 years in British politics with all these self-inflicted wounds, is that the Ministry of Defense has tended to operate beyond party. I think it was true, for example, when Ben Wallace was there at the outset of Ukraine. I think it's still true that the Ministry of Defense's approach is we've got a job to do. We've got a job to do in partnership with others, including with European partners post Brexit. And this is what we're going to do. I think it's actually been a small glimmer in terms of of what the UK can do when you don't have these bun fights of ideology and emotion that get in the way of doing what is best for us in the UK and also for those in Ukraine.